You're listening to Hooked on Creek, a podcast celebrating the music, history, and fans of the legendary jam band Max Creek. I'm your host, Korre Johnson, and you are listening to episode 14.
Well, they call it Stormy Monday. I said now Tuesday's just as bad. Well, they call it Stormy Monday.
Thank you for tuning in to episode 14 of Hooked on Creek. This is a very special episode because it features an interview with Greg DeGuglielmo. Greg played drums in Max Creek from 1985 to 1991. In this episode, you will hear Greg talk about how he became a member of the band, his experiences touring and recording albums with Max Creek, and his incredible memories of jamming with Scott, John, Mark, and Rob during his 6-year tenure in the band. Greg also talks about crossing paths with Phish while on tour with Max Creek and his friendship with Mike Gordon. We have a lot to cover in episode 14, so let's get started. Greg, thanks for joining me on Hooked on Creek.
Thank you, Korre. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before joining Max Creek in 1985, were you familiar with the band and their music?
It's funny, I was, but not as much as one would think, because given that I had a love for that style of music in bands such as the Allman Brothers and the Grateful Dead and Traffic and a lot of the bands that combine genres, that was a real fascination and still is. But that was early on, particularly in the early 80s, and I was going out and hearing so much live music. You'd think I would have gotten to a show earlier because I had heard of Max Creek. It wasn't until I believe it was 83, 84 that I saw my first show, and it was really a friend of mine from Harvard who told me about him. And I'll never forget when he first told me about him. It was this wonderful musician, Michael Land was his name. He was someone that I admired as a kid growing up and ended up playing in the band with him. In 80, 81, we had a band called Hygira together. And I'll never forget what he said, because Michael was very measured in his words and very thoughtful. And he said to me, Greg, he said, there's this band. They're called Max Creek, and I really want you to hear them. I really want you to hear them. And he made a point of saying that. You've got to hear these guys. And I said, yeah. I think I've heard the name. And he said, you got to see them live. You got to go see them live. They're like the Dead in that sense, but they're not the Dead. They got their own thing happening, and I really think you dig them. And I was like, okay, all right, well, coming from you, I will. I'll make a point of it. And so I trudged out to E.M. Lowe's one cold fall day, and I went with a friend of mine. It wasn't Michael, but it was someone else. And right from the get-go, I heard him, and I was like, wow, Michael's right. These guys got something. There is a similarity there to the Dead, but there's something definitely unique. And I remember hearing Gypsy Blue, but a lot of the songs I had never heard before. And some of them were covers that I wasn't quite familiar with. And I had, I was a music junkie, so I listened to all kinds of stuff. And I was intrigued by that. So the fact that they had their own originals. They jammed, really cool. And they definitely paid reverence to the Dead, but they were definitely not a Dead tribute. All those things were like really seductive to me. I made a note of it, like these guys are really special, but okay, I had no idea that I was going to end up spending my 20s with them on the road, that they'd become a huge part of my heart.
How did you first get involved in music, and was being in a band something you always wanted?
It's funny, Korre. I never made a conscious decision. It just happened. I mean, I was 14 years old when I got my first drum kit. And I had been banging on everything that I could get my hands on. And then my music teacher in junior high called up my parents and said, listen, you got to get this kid a drum kit because he's like destroying everything in my music closet. So I got my first drum kit at 14, but I was listening to music from my brother's collections and playing music. That was how I learned to play. That's how I really fell in love with music, was playing along the albums. From there, it was just a matter of playing in all different bands. Like for 7 years, 8 years before Max Creek, I was playing every weekend with friends and then practicing all week after school to headphones and records. You know, everyone, you know, really thought that, and thinks to this day, that I'm like this really educated drummer who's played with, you know, studied with one of the best teachers in the world. I was fortunate, Alan Dawson, who was a jazz legend and educator and performer extraordinaire, had that rare combination. And so when I joined Max Creek, I had been studying with Alan, which I didn't start till I was 17. My high school teacher called him and said, if you can get in with this guy, he happens to live in Lexington, Mass, where I was lucky enough to grow up. You know, I had no idea Alan Dawson was this world-class drummer who Miles Davis's drummer, Tony Williams, and all these famous people from Vinnie Colaiuta to Peter Erskine studied with. He was the one who taught me that, you know, being a drummer is being a musician. And that was when I started getting really serious. So that was 17, 18, and I was putting in 7, 8 hours a day on my instrument just to study with him. And that's the kind of stuff that led me to getting more serious after the 5 years of just playing by ear. And so it was Alan that got me going, and then I studied hard with him, and then college after that, and where I spent a lot of time on world music, where I was getting into world music. So by the time I went to that show at EM Lowe's to see Max Creek, I had just a plethora, just a really, I guess they'd say a gimbata in Italian. Just Rob Fried, God rest his soul, my rhythm partner in crime, he used to call it a melting pot. And that's what Max Creek was. And that's what I'm doing to this day. I look at it as a melting pot. Being an American who we have access to so many, you know, we're a country of people who came from all over the world. So there's all this incredible music available, you know, and I've always been attracted to bands that took Jerry Garcia's approach or Joni Mitchell's approach or Miles Davis's approach. And I don't mind mentioning those three in the same breath because those are three geniuses that had significant eras of creating with their respective musicians, but they drew on all the music in America that they were hearing, and they internalized it and played it. And you know, that's why I was kind of ready for a band like Max Creek because, you know, back in the day, Korre, being into the Dead, it wasn't something musicians respected. It's more respected now than it was back then. You were looked at as just somebody who smoked a lot of weed and was sloppy if you were a musician, you know? So it wasn't revered. Where I've always found that so ironic, and it was hearing Creek was part of that revolution for me, which was that that's so wrong because the Dead were a signpost, and Max Creek is still a signpost to the fact that there's multiple genres. I love how Joni Mitchell put it. I love music that gets all the hyphens in, she once said. The jazz, the rock, the folk, the blues, the funk, the Latin, the world music, all of it, classical. You know, there's influences from all over the world. And just in our own country alone, I look at it as rock, jazz, funk, and Latin. I like to break it down to those. But I have to include folk and rhythm and blues with that. And folk and jazz, like Charlie Hayden, the great jazz bassist. He had a penchant for swing and jazz, but he always loved folk melodies. And those people like Garcia and Dylan and the Beatles, Harrison, I mean, they're all hip to that fact, that they're not mutually exclusive. Joni Mitchell knew that early on, and that's a life's work, is what I'm trying to say. So it's ironic that being Into the Dead, or subsequently Max Creek, would have this connotation in the early 80s of being sloppy. Like the people I knew, the musicians I knew, it was like they were all into the King Crimson and all that, the heavy tech, yes, and all the technicians, all the technical players. And there's so much to be learned from them, but that stuff never, as Carlos Santana put it was like paper bullets. When they don't penetrate. It was hearing the Dead and certain songs by the Beatles and Paul Simon, even without drums, Simon and Garfunkel, there's certain songs, Cat Stevens was another one, certain songs that would go right up my spine. I mean, it's that feeling, right? It's ineffable. There's not really a way to describe it. It goes up your spine. So I found that really upsetting that it was looked at like that. And it still is by some people, but those bands are finally getting more respect. But, this whole jam band thing, I have about as much fondness for it as Billy Kreutzmann when he said, "What the fuck is a jam band?" It's like, that's a term that just became a term at some point. But yeah, we jam, but there's so much more than just jamming. It's all that stuff, I mentioned.
How did you get the invitation to join Max Creek? What was that like?
I had been studying at Berkeley for a semester and a half. I was there on a full scholarship. Alan Dawson had helped me to get, because his word was like gold there, and he referred me there for a full scholarship. And I was a semester and a half into it. My dad had just passed in '84. I wasn't really happy. I knew something was missing. I just knew it. It was a feeling. And one day, the fellow who I had been assigned lessons with for my first semester, Joe Hunt, he's still playing. He said, "What's up, man?" I told him, my dad died. I feel like I've been playing nonstop for 7-8 years. I got nothing to show for it. And there was this part of me, that old school part of me, that was like, I need to be a man or a woman and pay my way. I need to pay my bills. And I felt like I wanted to be doing it with my passion, but I never even thought about like music and making a living at it. I was so into the art of it. So Joe said to me, meditate on it. And so I did. Sure enough, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks later, I got this phone call from one of my older brother's friends. His name was Tony Betancourt, and he's still around, still playing. He works with Scott. He mentioned to me, he said, I wouldn't say this to anybody, but I've kind of followed you at a distance in your evolution as a player, and there's something you should know about that you might be interested in. I was like, why? What's up? He knew Scott, and he had heard that Bob Goslin, the drummer, the original drummer, was getting ready to get out, and it all happened pretty fast. And he said, you should, they're coming to town in a couple weeks. You should go see them. And I had just happened to have seen them just a couple months before that at E.M. Lowe's. So there was a synchronicity, that Jungian thing, that synchronicity involved here. There was something, in the stars about it. So then I was like, oh yeah, well, I saw them play just a few months ago at E.M. Lowe's. They're definitely players. I'll go see them. And they were playing at Jonathan Swift's. And then another friend, a guitar player named Bob Greco. Bob said to me, oh yeah, well, I got wind of it too. He said, you should check it out, man, because he knew I wasn't happy with Berkeley. So I went down to Harvard Square, and I went and heard him that night. And it was quite a night. I got there really early. I went after class. I was still going to Berkeley. And they were playing at Swift's, and I got there, I remember, really early. It was 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And there was no one around. I went downstairs because you had to go down this flight of stairs that club was. And there was this woman hanging like almost upside down, swearing and cussing in a light. And it was Linda Edick, also known as Little Wolf. And she's the light lady, the matriarch of the Max Creek family in my book. And anyway, she's going at it with this light. That was the first experience I had with Max Creek, was seeing her. And I laid eyes on her like, what the hell are you doing? And I think that's actually what I said to her. And because she was like almost upside down and she was cursing this light out, trying to get it in place. And I was thinking, you know, are you all right? Can I help you? And what the fuck are you doing? You know, I thought she was going to kill herself, you know. And she looked at me like with these wild kind of eyes. And instantly there was this like connection, just something. One of those ineffable things where there was this instant energy. And she's like, who are you? Those are our first words. Who are you? And I said, well, I'm Greg, and a friend of mine, two friends of mine, actually referred me to come down here and hopefully meet some of the guys in the band because I play drums and I heard that the drummer might be leaving, and through them. And she looked at me quizzically. And paused. I remember there was this pregnant pause, and she just looked at me, and she said, the guys are at dinner right now, she said, but I'll tell you where they are, but I'm trusting you on this because I got a feeling, and, you know, don't disappoint me. That's not verbatim, but something to that effect. So she told me where they were, so I went and sought them out at the restaurant they were at. I found the restaurant. And they were all sitting around a table having dinner. And I had to reintroduce myself. And I said, Linda, your light lady, told me you guys were sitting here and having dinner. And I just wanted to say I'm a drummer. And I heard your drummer's leaving. I heard you guys play in Worcester not long ago. And I'd like to find out more about it, if that's okay. I was really nervous, you know. I was timid and nervous and shy, but I did it. And I remember Rob was the first one to stand up and shake my hand, and he asked me, you know, where it was from and a little about my background. And I mentioned, you know, I was at Berkeley at that point. I don't think I said I had a full scholarship or anything like that, but I said I was studying. He's like, oh, wow, so you're like really schooled. I'm like, no, not really. I actually grew up self-taught playing the records. And he's like, oh, yeah, what kind of records? And I told him Allman Brothers, Grateful Dead, Jackson Browne, Jeff Porcaro, you know, all this stuff and all these wonderful folk musicians that didn't even have drums on it. Because I said I love songs. I love songs and melody, but I also love improvisation. And he just immediately took to me, and when I mentioned Alan Dawson, he said, how did Berkeley happen then? Why didn't you like... And I said, well, Alan Dawson helped me to get a full scholarship there. And he said, Alan Dawson? You know, Rob's eyes lit up. You know, he was like, whoa, man. You know, he knew more about Alan than I did. You know, and I had been studying with him. Once again, I didn't realize till years later, like, how heavy of a cat Alan was, you know. People came from Europe and Japan to study with him. And anyways, so then Rob's like, grab a seat, man, sit down, you know. So they pulled up a seat and I squeezed in between him and John. And I remember feeling like, oh man, you know, Rob introduced me to everyone. And I remember John being more reserved, which I think is the experience a lot of people have with John. He is reserved and he's very measured, especially when he's meeting people, and you know, but he was nice. None of them were arrogant or anything like that, but they were quiet. And I was, like I said, I was like, oh shit, you know, I was a little nervous. So they sensed that, and they were They went easy on me. But it was a quick dinner, and then everyone kind of dispersed. I said hello, and they said hello. And I can't remember if it was Mark Mercier or John, but it was one of the two. Said, why don't you come back? We're not on for like 4 hours. You know, they would start at 10 back then and play till 2. Like thinking to myself, oh man, I get class at 8. What am I going to do for 4 hours, you know? So I just ended up killing 4 hours of time going back to the club. And I went backstage. I told them I had met the band earlier, and they let me backstage, one of the road crew. And they brought me up on stage. Like, I didn't even know I was going to play. All of a sudden, I'm like backstage, and I hear this. So we got this drummer. His name is Greg, something to that effect, and he's going to sit in on one with us. And we ended up playing Stormy Monday, you know, the old blues tune that the Allman Brothers made famous, which was great because I used to play to that Fillmore East album all the time. I wore the grooves out on that album. In fact, people sometimes say to me, man, I love your shuffle feel. I said, well, I grew up playing the Statesboro Blues. You know, that's the song. I just played that shuffle over and over the way the Allmans played it. And I just loved it. So anyways, we played that song, which I was very familiar with. But I wasn't ready for like the long jam we did after it. It was just went on and on. We kept jamming and jamming. And then I think we went into Bertha, maybe. Might have been Bertha. But we went into a second song. And we rocked it out. And so they asked me to come back. There was something else significant that happened that same night. Bob Goslin listened intently to me while I was playing or from backstage. And I remember looking over at the door and seeing him looking at me, giving me this strange kind of look, you know. And he was checking me out. And he said to the band that night, after hearing me play 2 songs, which I swear lasted half hour to 45 minutes, he said, there's your guy. You got your guy. I'm out of here. And he basically, he left that night, pretty much. He said there was a few conversations, obviously, but I wasn't hip to the fact that Bob was that ready to go. But he was also, there was something else going on. Bob would never leave the band high and dry. He was waiting. He just knew. He heard me play, and he just said, you are the guy. So the next thing I knew, I was on the road with Max Creek, and I was playing 4 or 5 nights a week. I missed all my classes for the next 2 months. And then I realized, like, that, holy shit, I got to go see the dean and tell him what I'm doing. I remember talking to Rob and John and saying, I got Berkeley breathing down my neck. I disappeared, and, you know, I haven't even thought about it because everything just was right as rain, as they say.
At that point in time, what direction was Max Creek headed? Were they trying to take it to the next level? Did they have dreams of making it big?
At that point in time, there was no discussion about that. It wasn't until, I'd say, 86, 87, a year and a half, 2 years later, that there was some discussion about it. To specifically answer your question, the goal was just to make every show a special event, to put a concert on in a club. And, you know, we had a 5-man road crew. 10 people were living off the project. So we had to play 4 or 5 nights a week, 50 weeks a year, just so everyone could eat and pay their bills. But as my mom always said, everything exacts a price. And the people who play that often, there's a price to be paid for it. Just like there's a price to be paid for people who like, there's so many musicians today who are doing the day job and then they play on the weekend, which is what so many bands, including Creek, are doing, you know, have been doing. And there's a price to be paid for that too, because everything exacts a price. But the price for us at that point was none of us had personal life, so to speak of. I mean, we were tearing through girlfriends and wives, and it was brutal. You know, you were married you were married to the gig. That was your marriage.
During this period of the band, there was another band in the Northeast called Phish that was also touring, and I understand Phish would sometimes play the same venues and cross paths with Max Creek. Do you have any memories of those experiences with Phish?
I do have some great memories of all that. My girlfriend's younger sister told me about this band she was going to school with one day back in '87. And she said, Greg, you really got to check these guys out. They're called Phish, and I'm friends with them. She was actually one of their first 10 fans. Her name was Jennifer Kuker, which back then her name was Margot. She changed it to Jenny. I said, okay, Jen, I'll check them out. So I had an off night, and I went to the living room to hear them play. It was a rare off night, and they happened to be playing. I think it was like a Tuesday. I don't know. We typically had Monday and Tuesday off, and we played Wednesday through Sunday. Sometimes we wouldn't play on a Sunday night, but a lot of times we did. Thursdays and Sundays were what we called the ego deflation gigs. They were the filler gigs, and it's always something to learn from them. But it was I think a Monday or Tuesday. I went to the living room. They happened to be playing, and there was only like 50 people there. It was 1988, I think, and we had a much bigger crowd by that point, by 88, 89. We would sell out a lot of places like the Paradise and rooms that they were doing. What I'm trying to say is we were a bigger band at that point in time, in terms of commercial success or whatever. We were the band that they were catching up to in that sense. So anyways, I didn't care if there were 2 people there. I was going to give it as good a listen and enjoy it as much as I do. Some of the greatest shows I saw had less than 10 people there. So, these are monster players. So I understand all that. I walked into that night and I was like, I walked out just saying, what the hell was that? I mean, it was amazing to me because back then there wasn't much backbeat. Fishman wasn't playing much backbeat back then. Everything had a lot of twists and turns, a lot of tricky kind of corners. All the songs were really like, how do they remember that? It's not even written out, So I was really impressed when I first heard them that night. And there was no 2 and 4, I think, for the entire night. I remember just a few months after that show, Mike came up to me at a show we were doing way up in Burlington, Vermont, and he introduced himself to me. And he said, I play in this band Phish, and I've been listening to your drumming, and, I've seen you guys play, and I love the way you and the guitar player play together. He said, and I love your whole band, but I really love the way you and Scott play off each other. That was one of the first things he said to me. And I said, oh, thanks, man, because we would play off each other a lot, Scott and I. I did with the whole band, but him and I had this thing where, I'm not going to put my name or his name with guys like the way Tony Williams played off Miles, or the way Jerry played off the drummers, or the way, Alvin played off of Coltrane. I don't know. I'm not, Scott deserves to be in that group more than me, but I'm just saying that there's that axis between the soloist and the drummer that we followed. Mitch Mitchell had it with Hendrix. There was an axis between the drummer and the leader, Not that Scott was the leader, but during his songs was the leader. John's songs, he was the leader. Mark's songs, he was the leader. So, but they were all reluctant leaders. No, there was no real clear-cut leader. But Scott and I had a natural sort of axis, is the best word I can describe. And Mike expressed to me how he really noticed that. And that was one of the things he loved about Creek. And I said, thanks, because I just heard you guys play at the living room, and I was amazed at the way you just weaved in and out of things, and there was no backbeat. And he's like, yeah, I kind of wish I want to get more groove going, because sometimes it's just, it's so much weaving and just not enough backbeat. And, sometimes I try to tell the guys or tell a drummer, I've mentioned your band to my bandmates, and Trey had come to see us before. Just him and Trey had come out, and Trey liked us as well. not as much as Mike, but Trey did like us. The other two had no interest, but they knew of us. They knew of us. And Mike said, "I'll tell you later." This is kind of a funny thing that he said to Fishman one day, but got him in some trouble or some heat or something for a comment he made about Max Creek and the way we improvise and, listen to the way DeGug plays the backbeat, but then we'll flip things around and jam. And, I want to have that type of breath. And that's not verbatim, but basically that was what he was going back to the band and saying. And they were kind of like, yeah, fuck yourself, whatever. No, I don't know what they said, but I was like, Mike, you didn't really say that, because we ended up becoming friends. And he's like, yeah, I did, But this was back in 88, right? 88, 89. We became friends. So one thing led to another. We exchanged phone numbers. Then he would come to Collinsville, where I was living with Little Wolf. I lived with her for 3 or 4 years. But Mike would come out on a Monday or Tuesday when they would be off. He would drive from his place up in Jericho, Vermont, all the way down outside of Burlington, up near Canada. He'd drive to Collinsville, and he'd just come down just to session, just drums and bass. We did about, 4 or 5 of those sessions that we'd play for a few hours, and we taped them. I still have the cassettes. One of the guys in the Creek world who does a lot of audio stuff wants me to find them, and I do have them, the cassettes of the drums and bass. They're just buried somewhere right now because I'm in the process of moving again. And we would just play grooves and experiment. Mike and I would do these drum and bass jams that were just off the charts. I mean, we were trying to do stuff that, if I had to put a term to it, it was kind of like Latin funk. And I was trying to apply that to the music and the jams that Creek was doing. And Mike said to me once, he's like, man, you're the only drummer like I've heard in this whole genre that is playing some of these types of grooves, because I would play like a Songo or a Mozambique, and then we'd jam out of it. And that's another thing that, outside of the jazz and the swing, that is hugely important. If there's any musicians listening to this, that's you really want to learn how to jam, learn clave, learn Latin music, because that is key to being able to jam. It's like a seminal rhythm that provides all kinds of avenues to go down. And Scott loves Latin rhythms. Even the most recent session we did, he was like, play some Latin grooves, Anyways, Mike and I would do this in 88, 89. And, we'd tell each other about each other's bands. And, Trey was receptive. Trey even wrote a letter to me once that I ended up giving to our keyboardist, Mark, about how how he appreciated what Max Creek did and how he had heard that there was some kind of riff there about something. And he was so thoughtful and so sweet. And he wrote it to me, and he gave it to me. But it was something to the extent of, we really do love you guys, and we'd like to do more stuff. Because at that point, we were playing similar venues. We opened for them. They opened for us, actually, once up in Vermont. And I can't remember. We may have played one other time where it was a co-bill or something like that. I was telling them about Phish, and there wasn't really any reciprocity back. Like, I remember, and it was probably, in everyone's defense in the band, it was probably because we were so busy playing. And I remember saying distinctly that, they're doing something, guys, that I really wish we would try and do. And they're like, what are you talking about, Greg? And I would say, and this was like 90, 91. I would say they take time out to strategize, to rehearse, to talk about their goals, their short-term and long-term goals. And these were all things I knew because my friendship through Mike. And even Mike said to me at one of those jams we did, he's like, we play a lot, but he said, you guys tour insane. He said, this was around 1990. He said something to the extent of, I wouldn't be surprised if these last 5 years you guys set a Guinness Book of World Records. I wouldn't be surprised, he said to me. And he said that you probably played more shows in a 5-year span than anyone. Because we did. We were playing nonstop. Like I said, we would take 2 weeks off a year. That was it.
What was it like to be in a band with a percussionist? As a drummer, did you consider yourself fortunate to be in a band with a percussionist where the two of you could develop that sound and that rhythm for Max Creek?
Well, before that, those 7 years I mentioned of studying and playing records and playing in a myriad of bands, I didn't work with a percussionist. I had only played just solo drum kit. So I've done both, and I've done a lot of solo and double drum since Max Creek, but it is different. There's no doubt about it. Now, Rob Fried is anyone familiar with Max Creek knows, is not your average percussionist. He was brilliant, and I miss him like everybody. But Jamie's doing a hell of a job, I have to say, too, with the band right now on percussion. And I found one of the first things I had to do was something that I've always kind of had an affinity for. It wasn't something I learned in school or anything like that, and that was to listen. I just had to listen more, because with a percussionist, a lot of things that you would normally do, to be more musical, you would leave out, or you try to. In our case with Rob, we were more similar to the Allman Brother drummers and the Dead drummers in that we never played the same thing. We weren't two guys mimicking the same part. Which, some bands like the Doobie Brothers, they did that, and they did it great. It's not knocking it. Every situation has its merits. And there's something to be said for that, too. But we were more into that whole idea of complementing each other. We're two distinct people who bring our own experiences and chops into it, and we have to treat it as such. Sometimes with the double drums, it was a little trickier because, and I didn't come to appreciate this till years later, but Rob had an amazing groove. I mean, he could groove, and he had the best press roll in the business. And it was just unbelievable. I mean, there were things he could do on the kit that were just marvelous. But there were also limitations, too, because that wasn't his primary instrument. His primary instrument was percussion. So he was a percussionist playing drums. And we would do, back then, we'd do like half the shows we do roughly would have big enough stages where we'd have two kits and Rob's percussion, or I should say my kit, percussion, and a second drum kit. And then there were plenty of stages we played which we would just do my kit and the percussion. That alone took up a ton of space. And it worked. I mean, we would adjust. And I think it wasn't until later on in my development, post-Creek, that I really, really appreciated some of the things on kit that Rob did do and could play. And namely, he was heavy into just laying down a groove.
You mentioned earlier about the need to listen to Rob, and that's making me think of that thing that makes Max Creek so special, which is that improvisational style of their music. How did Max Creek develop that improvisational style, and how were you able to contribute to it and listen for it?
It happened very organically. John Ryder never said a whole lot about anything to anyone. But one day backstage, he said to me, and I'll always remember it, he said, you and I have a real connection with the bass and drums. It's an organic thing. Yeah, that makes sense. Organic things evolve. They're not really planned out. They're not really discussed a lot. And that was the case with the foundation, the bass and the drum set, which is your foundation, that everything else sits on. The improvisation, Max Creek, we were like brothers in the sense that we loved that spirit of adventure. We loved it. We shared that desire to use that Joni quote I used earlier, get all the hyphens in, which, you know, Joni did in her songs, but the Dead, for instance, or Little Feat or the Almonds, they would do it in their jams, you know, as well as their songs. We shared that. We shared that love. So really, when you really get down to it, we had a jazz mindset. That's the key. We all shared a jazz mindset. And that's something that even the Dead tribute bands, you know, they're great at what they do, but I don't even hear them doing the jams. I gotta say, the jamming is something that it's precious to me. I love it, and I don't have to. It's like when I'm jamming and I'm in the zone, and I'm listening to everything, but I'm not thinking. I'm just everything I've studied and thought about to get to that spot is out the window. I'm trying to get in the moment. I'm in the zone, and when I'm really in the zone, I'm just flowing. I'm just flowing with everybody, and I'm not thinking in terms of notes or rhythms. I'm not even in the thinking brain. I'm somewhere else. I'm in the flow. It's a universal flow, and that flow is what everybody in the band and everybody in the audience is a part of. And I know all that sounds cliche, but it's cliche for a reason. It's so true. It's bigger than any one of us. And you just get out of your own way and you let everything you've studied and ingest in the past have its spot, but not need to be said, but ready to go. And you're in the flow. That's when those jams happen. And Max Creek was just, they're naturals at it. It's not something, our jams would just happen on their own. They would play us. We didn't play them.
During your time with the band, Max Creek released 2 studio albums. Were you able to participate in the recording sessions on those 2 albums? And was the band able to create some of that magic that comes through in live performances while recording in the studio?
On the second album, MCMXC, 1990, yes. The first album, no. The first album we did Windows shortly after I joined the band, and the songs hadn't even developed the parts yet. Relics wanted us to do some new material that ended up becoming staples and had already started. Some of the tunes had started, you know, with Bob, and some of them hadn't. But we were still finding the parts. And Korre, we couldn't take time to rehearse because we were playing. So, in fact, we never rehearsed. I learned everything on stage. Rob gave me like this huge collection of Max Creek stuff and threw it at me and said, "Here you go." And I was like playing at night with them. In the daytime, I had headphones on for hours at a time. And I learned everything on stage. And Scott would help. Scott's probably one of the best cuers in the world, you know, because he would guide you through things and he'd give you the best cues. He'd give you a look or a gesture, you know, but he'd always do it at the perfect time. And he really helped. And the fact that I was ready and listening and trying to play with a certain awareness and preparedness, I'd be receptive to any sort of gestures and cues that would come my way. And that's how we were able to learn the material, was on stage. I mean, we didn't get to take time out. Like I said, I had only heard the band play once, so I didn't know they were originals. And then there was a whole batch of originals that Scott was just starting with that we developed parts for. So that first album, you know, it was like a matter of that album was a spontaneous performance of songs that we were still developing, or I was developing parts for with the band. So yeah, the first album, I wish we had gotten to do a little later on when the parts had evolved more and had solidified more. But there's some great things on there too that, you know, that were fun to record and challenging, and that's all you can do is take every situation as it arises and do your best. And You can't say, oh, we couldn't say to Relics, check in with us in a year and a half, 450 shows from now. We'll do it then, which would have been great. It would have been great just to do that album in 87 or 88 instead of 86, But 1990, we did have that luxury, which we recorded in Bobby Harry's house in New Hartford, Connecticut. We did recording right in his living room of his custom-built wood house, beautiful place, right on a lake, right down the street from where I was living in New Hartford. And we did something John Archer did at the time, which was pretty unheard of, which was, it had been done, but not often. And I think there were certain things we did that hadn't been done before. But we basically did a live mix with just a few people in his house. We played like a concert. We just recorded the songs without any tracks. We just played together at the same time, like we were playing a concert. And we knew the tunes well enough that we could do that. There's so few overdubs on that. Everything was done like 1 or 2 takes, and just we were ready to play those songs at that point because we'd been playing them out, and they had parts. And we just did a performance without the audience at that point. So that was unusual.
How would you describe the relationship between Max Creek and fans of the band? While you were in the band, was that relationship with the fans something you would look forward to when performing? And is it something now, since you left Max Creek, that you still cherish?
They're the X factor. They really are. Without them, it's nothing. They're as integral to it as anyone. As much as our agent back then was a fellow named Mark Gentilella of Flash Groups. And we used to make jokes, that he had a dartboard, he would, in a map on the wall, and he would throw darts at the map. And that was the joke, that he was Mark's playing darts again, because one night would be in Rochester, the next night would be in Providence, or something crazy where he'd have to drive, and then zigzag back 8 hours somewhere, stuff like that. But he was integral to us. And in a different way. He was integral on the business side. And on the spiritual side, the fans, what do the French say? Raison d'être, the reason to be. They're one of a kind. The Deadheads are like that with the Dead, but Max Creek has its own thing. It always did. It always will. It's touched so many people's lives. As Scott eloquently said recently, it's bigger than any one of us. And it really is. It truly is bigger than any one individual. There's a huge part of my heart that's always going to be Max Creek, tattooed on it. It's right here. I love the band. I love the fans. I love guys like you who have been bitten by the bug and have done something with it. Really, all the people who archive the stuff, and it's just amazing. It's a labor of love, and that's what music is. It's a labor of love.
Greg, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for joining me on Hooked on Creek.
Korre, thank you so much yourself. I really, really appreciate it. It's been an honor and a privilege to talk with you. And my best to everybody in the band and the fans, past and present. I love you guys. Always will.
And that concludes my interview with Greg DeGuglielmo. While my interview with Greg focused primarily on his years playing in Max Creek, music continues to be a huge part of Greg's life beyond Max Creek. In addition to teaching private drum lessons, Greg has been involved in numerous musical projects and bands over the years, including Slipknot, which now goes by the name The Knot. If you're interested in private drum lessons or connecting with Greg, visit his website, gregdegoog.com, or connect with Greg on Twitter at GregDeGoog. That's spelled GregDeGug. Direct links are in the show notes. And if you're curious, during the introduction to this episode, I played Max Creek's version of Stormy Monday, performed live at the West Hartford Music Hall in West Hartford, Connecticut on October 8th, 1988. I would love to know what you think of my interview with Greg, or if you have suggestions for future episodes of Hooked on Creek. To get in touch with me, simply visit hookedoncreek.com and click the contact link to send me a message. And you're always welcome to join the Hooked on Creek community on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for tuning in.